Welcome to this episode of the NewSpace India podcast, a bi-weekly talk show that exclusively talks about India's space activities. The traditional way of entering space business in India was to work with ISRO and go through a vendor qualification system where ISRO would come and qualify the facilities and the manpower of a particular vendor, and the vendor would then enter the ISRO supply chain. Of course, this brought a lot of constraints to the vendor because the vendor could never graduate to then assembling an entire satellite or an entire rocket over the last 30 years. This also meant that the vendor traditionally never took a risk to build a satellite of their own and offer services on top of that. One of the hallmarks of the emergence of new space in India is the emergence of startups who are planning to build their own set of satellites, which can provide services directly to businesses or consumers. This is definitely a big change from the traditional vendor system of ISRO or the suppliers in the ISRO ecosystem, since these companies are really talking about vertically integrating themselves by using satellites as assets in space, which can then provide services on top of it. In this episode of the NewSpace India podcast, I chat with Kshitij, who is the CTO of one such team called Pixxel, which plans to put together a satellite series which can image the Earth and provide insights and analytics to tackle various different problems that we have in the society. Kshitij, welcome to this episode of the NewSpace India podcast. Thank you very much, for taking some time during the weekend to get on the show.
Thank you for having me here, Narayan, and thank you for continuing the podcast. Both Wes and I at Pixxel, we are a huge fan of the podcast, and thanks for doing what you do. It's really great.
Tell me a little bit about your and Awes's background, and how do you guys got into space? How did you meet? How did your project begin?
Both of us, we come from really small places in India. I am from the Vidarbha region in Maharashtra, and Awes is from Chikmagalur here in Karnataka. And both of us met at BITS Pilani, where we both were studying in the same year. Awes was one of the founding team members at Hyperloop India. This was India's first entry into the SpaceX Hyperloop challenge. In 2017, this team participated, got selected as one of the finalists, and then the entire team built the pod here in Bangalore and took it to LA and presented it to Musk. So that's sort of how I met Awes. I was one of the members of the Hyperloop India team. We'd already been friends, and after the whole Hyperloop India thing, we just realized we work really well professionally as well. And since then, we started looking at opportunities and different problems we could solve. One of them was the IBM Watson AIX Prize, and we wanted to solve problems in India that affected the population as a whole. One of the biggest challenges in India is making agriculture more efficient. So we started with that, and we realized that we could work with satellite imagery to actually create this change at a large scale. So that's sort of how Awes and I met each other. And we would been huge fans of space and space stuff. So yeah, that's sort of how we got into creating Pixxel.
When you're, of course, students, the setting is very different, and university settings are, of course, very different. I also, as a student, participated in some of the university projects, and I know that, the shift between doing something at a university where you have certain backing of friends or family is very different from, starting a company, right? So in that context, what actually made you to pick this area, and did you guys think that this was a good time to start, or you wanted to just maybe work for some companies in India which are doing space? What was the thing that made you do a company rather than just work for someone?
I mean, we are both ambitious by nature, and we both love space. So personally, for me, ever since I was a kid, I read about the Voyager missions, and I was just a big fan of what we as a species can do. And since then, growing up on the stories of the heroics of the Indian Space Research Organization and the stuff they pulled off, which was really commendable. We were on that trajectory. We wanted to be a part of this change that was coming. we could see that SpaceX was doing some incredible stuff. It still is. The ecosystem as a whole was growing very rapidly at that point, and we wanted to be a part of that. We wanted to be able to contribute something, but we just did not want to take the long road towards that. Given that both of us were interested, we had a real problem to solve. We were also at the right time to solve that problem. Making a space company, building a space company, seemed like the right thing to do. So far, it has been a very interesting journey.
So when you wanted to do something more in space and trying to look at different things, space is of course encompassing a lot of things. You could have chosen to build rockets, or you could have chosen to build ground systems. You could have chosen to do space applications. Or there's tons of other things that you could actually do. So what led you to looking at problems related to agriculture, or then focus on more of satellite imaging? Was this because of your own personal experiences, backgrounds, or was it something that you thought is now more interesting to solve?
And that's an interesting question. Both of us had seen some problems firsthand. Personally, for me, coming from that farming background, I've seen problems in Vidarbha, which is the drought-prone region in India, which is known as the drought-prone region in India. And apart from that, even with pollution in Delhi, with so many different things on ground that needed solutions, we could not just go and do something outrageous, because one, it requires a lot of capital. As students, that was really difficult. And second, we wanted to continue that trend that ISRO had set of being nimble and also giving very hard results on ground. So those are the two reasons why we, instead of making a rocket company or doing some other space-based applications, we set our hearts on remote sensing, because it had very real applications on ground.
Yeah, I mean, that's always a very interesting, I would say remote sensing is one of the niches which has been underexplored in India quite a lot. Because I think a lot of what ISRO generate in terms of capacity of imaging is mostly used in government to government applications. And I actually haven't seen many of the applications that goes down to the end users to a very deep extent that can actually affect the economy. I think it's a very interesting area that you are definitely working on. Tell me a little bit about when you approached this problem set, did you happen to do some research on what ISRO had in terms of imaging, if you could access that imagery and do some applications on top of that? Or did you find that ISRO was not addressing certain problems or certain kind of image quality or image availability? Tell me a little bit about these kinds of angles where you saw gaps in the system.
So in the beginning, we were working with open datasets, open imagery datasets. While working with them, we tried to understand what the problems with these datasets were. Like I mentioned, we started with the IBM Watson AI X Prize and actually wanting to participate in it. But then we realized that the current satellite imagery isn't good enough. Either it does not have a good revisit, or it does not have a good resolution, or the proper coverage. There are multiple factors. So that was one. As far as ISRO goes, one of the first few people we reached out to were folks at NRSC, and they definitely are doing some credible work. They are working on their data set. They've got a great bunch of scientists, some great people who are working on this data. But again, they are limited in the scope, and they're also limited by policy, by other grants that come. So there are a lot of restrictions on those people, even though they are doing some incredible stuff. We wanted to get out of those restrictions. We wanted to do this on a global scale. That's sort of the difference I feel is there. That's sort of the change from that mindset is there.
So you and Awais, of course, you were the guys who originally started this project or the company together now. Did you find any of your students or any other alumni from your, from your university also backing you? How did you build up the team for this?
Aves was a part of the student satellite team at BITS. He knew the team that we would need to put together, the kind of people we would need to go ahead. We actually started with some very outrageous timelines in the summer of last year. And then through talking to different people like yourself, talking to different people in the industry, we realized that we need to set more attainable goals. As far as people from our own college go, Manas and Tejasvi are the first two people who joined us. They were from a same batch. They do comms and mechanical thermal stuff respectively. Apart from that, we got a bunch of juniors as well. We got people on the AI side. So there's definitely a lot of interest in projects of this kind. And because we had that experience in building a very hardcore technical team while being a part of Hyperloop India, we just replicated that model when we began.
Interesting. So when you were talking to some of these ISRO people, what was their reaction when you said, okay, did you tell them that you want to begin a project that will look at independently having a company that will do imaging? What was their feedback like?
We had an interesting approach to that. We actually, whenever we used to talk to people where we felt that it might not be a good idea to just tell them that we were a little scared as students, we just told them that this was a student project. And actually it was at that time where we were focused more towards research and not actual market analysis. That came somewhere around October, November of last year. But the reaction was they were surprised, some of them. Some of them were actually happy that there is a fresh initiative of this kind coming. People at NRSC were very happy when they heard what we are trying to do. There were mixed reactions, but mostly they found it refreshing, I would say that.
Mm-hmm. And how did you bring up the capital? Did you have an idea of how much capital you would need? What was the runway like? Who would be your backers? Were all of these clear during the early days, or how did you navigate all of this?
In the very beginning, around April, May of last year, we just had a very broad idea. Again, the way we had worked for Hyperloop, we set out to make a bill of materials. We tried to budget the whole thing. But then there are a lot of costs that are involved in running a startup that are not exactly the technology cost. So then we got our financial models reviewed by a lot of experts in the field. And we sort of iterated every week at one point of time. Aves was the one who was actually looking at this, and he spent a lot of nights creating something that looked like a definitive model. And even at this point, we try to work on making it more accurate. But yeah, that's how we've come to involve all the different costs that have been associated. And over time, we've learned to add costs that usually people tend to overlook.
Yeah, given that in India there is not really an ecosystem where you can get a lot of research-oriented funding. If you are in NASA ecosystem or the ESA ecosystem, you have some of these grants, which is the SPIR grant or STR grants, or in ESA you have the SBIC, which is the Business Incubation Center, that gives you at least a little bit of runway for all of this. Given that in India you don't have that kind of leverage for some kind of funding that can actually give you some kind of cushion to build up your IP, what was your approach? So did you just say we'll go to friends, family and raise some money until we get some investors, or did you already have some angel investors who were interested in the project and were willing to back you? Or
when we started out around May of last year to raise money, we were thinking that it would not be that difficult, given the whole Hyperloop scenario where we had raised sponsorship. But it was tens of times more difficult than that, because when we reached out to people, they wanted to see everything, starting from a pitch deck to your financial projections. We reached out to, because there were no grants, we reached out to private equity sector. We reached out to investors, and we got a number of no's for a lot of months. Then it was somewhere around October. Aves was due to give his exams, the mid-semester exams for his final year. And there was this event by BITS Pilani alumni in the Bay Area. One of these companies that we were working with, one of their members lended us some money Aves booked tickets to travel to the Bay Area, and he pitched Pixxel. So the first few commits came from our alumni who really liked what we were doing. More as a young team, even though some of them did not understand exactly we were trying to do. But yes, that those commits came as they started coming in. As people started believing in us, we started refining our business model much better, because if there is no market, there is no scope to get good funding. So we tried to define our market really well and then raise money through private equity. But yes, it would have been a lot easier if there were actual research grants, substantial actual research grants in India as well, just like NASA and ESA has them.
Yeah, I mean, it's also a double-edged sword in my experience, because we have some funding from, for example, from ESA, and always the paperwork always seems more than actually the time that we spend for the money. So sometimes it's also kind of a double-edged sword in that sense. But yeah, it's definitely a good option to have to get the branding, the backing or the branding behind, and also some cushion, as I said. Right now, what is the team size like? What is your current growth like, and what is your current projections or targets?
Sure. So just to add to the last thing, you mentioned having backing from ESA or NASA, and we also felt that was really important, because we were doing the work that we were doing, but there was no real validation for it. And I think that came through the Techstars Starburst Space Accelerator program that we were part of for the last 3.5 months. And because of partners like Jet Propulsion Laboratory, NASA, Lockheed Martin, Maxar, and many others, we actually got validation for our technology, for our business model, for our market. Yeah, I think that is really important as well. Now, coming to your next question, the team size right now, we are 9 people. There's 2 of us, Aves and I, who are involved in a lot of different things, from fundraising to customers to supply chain. There's 5 of us who are involved in manufacturing, testing, design, all of that. And there's 2 of us who are involved solely for the data infrastructure, image processing work that we are doing.
Very good. So when you actually started looking at supply chain and who you could work with in India, given that a large number of companies are already working with ISRO, did you have an extensive visit to some of these companies that work with ISRO, or what was your experience like with them, and what were your insights that you could share?
Supply chain was very difficult to start with, because people need to establish that level of trust, and when you are a new company altogether, they don't tend to give you that much attention, and they don't tend to share technology with you because of different fears. But we found the space ecosystem globally really helpful. And as far as India goes, there are a lot of these companies in India that supply to ISRO, like you mentioned, and they're not very well known, but they do build space qualified components, and their components have space heritage. So we visited a few of these in Bangalore, in Chennai, in Mumbai as well. Even though they have existed for a lot of years, then there needs to be a fresher outlook at this ecosystem as well. There are no solar panel suppliers in India. Space grade solar panel suppliers in India. Even if you want batteries that are qualified for a space mission, you can't find them in India. So, I mean, you may be able to, but it's difficult to find all these companies. In part, thanks to you, we were able to find a lot of different companies outside of India as well, who could supply us with components like these. So, yeah, shout out to SatSearch.
Thank you. But I want to dig deep into your actually experience with some of the local vendors in India. When you approached them, what was their reply back to you? Were they saying we only do specific components, or we only can help you with specific processes of manufacturing, or build to print kind of approach? or what was the general feedback like?
It was very mixed, but in general, a lot of these companies lack serious documentation because they have been supplying to ISRO for so many years, because they haven't really had other customers in that particular segment of their operations. They tend to ignore these things that are usually necessary when I go and talk to them, whether it's about quality control, the testing methodology that they have. A lot of these things are usually missing, but some of them do have an end-to-end process, but for separate components. There is no single manufacturer of the entire sat bus, let's say, in India. You'll have to find a different guy who makes your reaction wheels. You'll have to find a different person who will be making the boards that will go into a satellite. You'll have to find someone else who will be doing the integration, and then testing facilities, again, an entirely different thing. So you have to be involved in putting different pieces of the puzzle together in place.
Did some of the scientists in ISRO or somebody in ISRO also help you figure out which suppliers you could work with, or made some recommendations?
Yeah, so the ex-ISRO scientists that we worked with have been really helpful to us. Special thanks to Dr. Krishnaswamy, Dr. Rajangam. They actually, when we talked to them, these were the people who heard us, who thought that this could go and be a tangible product, be something big. And they've been guiding us throughout the course of our journey so far, regarding not just suppliers, but also regarding testing facilities, from very simple things to the things that matter. I mean, the deployer stuff that we've been working on in terms of the launch vehicle integration. So yes, we've had a lot of support from ex-ISRO scientists that we've worked with.
Excellent. I'm very happy to hear that. I think most often some of the former ISRO scientists, they definitely are really helpful in figuring it all out. I read some news from you guys, which was out that one that you booked a launch with precious payload or using I think Glav Cosmos. And you were also, I think last week I read news that you also have a ground station partner, which is NewSpace in Italy. So did you happen to, what was your consideration as to why you chose these partners rather than somebody local? Or
it's about putting those pieces of the puzzle together. And because our focus was on operating these satellites, on working on the data to generate information for our customers, we decided not to venture into the whole setting up your own ground station thing. We definitely are not making our own launch vehicles, but it was a great experience working with these people. They've been really professional. As far as choosing them goes, there are multiple factors involved. For the launch vehicle, it's about the orbital parameters, the LTAN that we want. It's about from the altitude to the launch window that they provide. So these are different technical factors involved. There are also other factors in terms of the cost associated with launch. These are really expensive. Apart from that, just on the regulation side as well, we wanted the process to be a little smoother. As far as the ground station network goes, we wanted to partner with a global ground station network. And because we were operating in S-band, VHF, UHF, NewSpace is the best option, in my opinion, to operate in that region. We've had a really good experience working with Giovanni Taylor and the team. So those are sort of the reasons for choosing these providers. For the ground station, especially getting more passes. So a global ground station network makes that easier.
Absolutely. And one of the interesting bits here also is that in one of the episodes where I talked to the chairman of Antrix, I had mentioned to him that the 18% GST for Indian companies for launch, which is waived for the foreign companies, may affect companies like you, for example. And he had replied back saying, we are trying to lower the cost so that it offsets the taxes. So I'm not sure if they implemented all of these, but I hope they do in the future.
Yeah, I hope so too. So it's about the policy change that has been pending for some time, and I hope that happens soon. We would love to work with ISRO. I mean, we are huge fans, not just because we're huge fans of ISRO, because the PSLV is a very reliable launch vehicle, and it would make things simpler for us logistically as well.
We talked about your overall process at the moment and how you're trying to build up your team and a little bit of funding and so on. Tell me a little bit about what is the satellite planning to do? What is the payload? A little bit about the specs of what you're trying to fill as gaps in terms of the images itself.
Narayan, the way we started, we wanted to have real on-ground applications, and we saw these problems in agriculture. Like, to start with, we saw these problems in agriculture in terms of people not being able to detect what disease there is, not able to find out the health of the crop, and not able to do that at a large scale. I mean, you can do that with drones, but maybe for a taluka or maybe for a district at maximum. But when you want to do it at a state level, when you want to do it at a nationwide level, having satellite imagery becomes really important. So we reverse engineered from the solution to the problem, and we talked to these different organizations that worked with satellite imagery to actually solve these problems, even with drone imagery. While talking to these people, we realized that there were certain lapses. There were these particular requirements for the data that they needed, for the information that they needed. There were some things that they did not want to do that we are trying to take care of as well. So we realized those, and the information that we provide essentially helps people detect a particular crop species, because if it's mixed farming, like which is very common in India, it's difficult to find out what the species of the crop is. Then there are things like finding out the health of the crop, finding out the moisture content and the leaves in the soil, the health of the soil itself, finding out what nutrients there are. Also, if there is any disease, if there is any pest infestation, we can detect that. And all these things enable us and our customers to be able to predict, let's say, yield of the crop, which is again very beneficial for people in the commodity sector. So that is what our data enables us to do. Along with these applications, there are other applications in oil and gas, in mineral exploration, in environment conservation, in pollution detection. So we really have a very good shot at solving a lot of these problems, a lot of these issues for our customers. And to start with, we're focusing on agriculture.
There is quite a lot of free imagery and free image sources, for example. Today, I know a lot of teams, for example, that are using Sentinel, Landsat, and this kind of open image data. So essentially, what do you see as lacking in this open data today that you may be able to bridge?
Yeah. So with open data and with commercially sold data, there are problems like revisit rates. There are problems with respect to the coverage of these satellites. Sometimes there are issues with the resolution. The best resolutions aren't available freely. And if there are sources of very good resolution data, they are usually very expensive. So with Pixxel satellites, because we have a really low cost of manufacturing these satellites, we are able to price our data, our information much lower than most sources available. We have the wealth of data that we provide enables our customers to do much more than they can do with the usual sources. And we definitely have worked with sources like Sentinel data, like Landsat data, and some commercial sources of data as well. And we have tried to figure out what can happen better, and those things have been implemented while building our satellites. So all those learnings have gone directly into our camera.
Awesome. So from what I understand at the moment, you really have, from an end user's perspective, are looking at more like not just supplying imagery, but providing a service on top of the imagery that you will be able to collect.
Yeah, Narayan, definitely. So there are different things that our customers need to do with the imagery, and they don't want to be taking that effort of processing raw data to clean data, and just instead of spending their time and effort and energy working on this imagery, we do it for them. We do all the legwork for them, I guess, and we provide them with actionable information. We provide them with information that they can directly implement into their detection models, into their prediction-based analysis, or whatever they want to do with the data, with the information.
Of course, when you are building some service like this, building a B2B business normally is extremely difficult, especially to convince companies if you are a new company by yourself. So when you talk to the end users, you see your primary end users at the moment, at least when you're kicking off your initial services, as Indian stakeholders, Indian companies that will use this service, or are you then just spending most of your time outside of India talking to customers as the first adopters?
Yeah, so fortunately, the way we went around building our satellites, which was talking to these people first, helped us a lot because we knew what exactly was their pain point, what things they required, and what things they could not get from existing sources of satellite imagery. So when we go and talk to a customer, it's mostly about understanding what their actual problems are, listening to them, and then seeing how best our product can fit with them. And in most cases, we've had a very positive response from people because there is a need for this kind of information. There is a requirement by customers who want this information. It has very real applications as well. So because of all these things, we've been able to talk to our customers in a more friendly way than we would have expected to. But again, because we do not have an asset up in space right now, it's difficult to convince these customers. So we are moving to provide them with sample data so that they can work with it, so that they can take their time to understand how it can best fit with their models and then go ahead with it. So we've put those checks and balances in place to make sure that we provide the best value to our customers.
Yeah, I was also a little bit more interested in the geography as well because, since I guess most of your team is based in India, although you've spent quite a lot of time now in the US with the Techstars accelerator as well. So you see as the market, which is, perceivable market, the first customers and where you could tap the first business out as prominently being India or not in Indian customers?
Even if you take agriculture to start with, more than half the world's population is engaged in agriculture. It's a domain where we can talk to a customer, whether it's in India, whether it's in Europe, or if it's in the US, and understand that the problem they have is something that we can solve. So in India, we've been very actively talking to different players in this industry to understand how we can work with them. And fortunately, we are working with one of them, SkyMet, based out of New Delhi, Noida. We've also talked to people in the United States who have been really interested because of the Techstars accelerator. One of our aims for the Techstars accelerator was to get customer traction in the US. And we've talked to big companies, small companies alike, to understand how our product can benefit them.
Can you give a couple of examples on what is the gap today in the market and how you may be able to fill that?
In some cases where you have satellite imagery, you are able to find out if a crop is doing well, if it's doing okay, if it's doing moderate. This information does not translate very well into getting predictions for yields of that particular crop. Even if you have on-ground data, surveys and other things, they are very prone to human errors. A lot of these things aren't scalable because they are done in a very selected region. Apart from that, with current satellite imagery, sometimes the quality is not good enough. Sometimes the resolution is not what they want. Many a times, it's not financially viable to purchase that much satellite imagery, that much data from a particular commercial organization and then use that, because not all of these companies would have the resources to do that. So quality, cost, and just the revisit rates and the coverage, those are the few gaps that are there with the satellite imagery that is currently available. Again, with regards to processing, sometimes the customers, they have to adapt to a particular source of satellite-based information. And we do not want them to do that. We want to just provide them with what they exactly need.
So one of the aspects that you talked about a little bit is also the policy aspects, which we didn't talk during this time. Are there any policies that affect you? Because I guess, the only policy that I can think of at the moment is really the remote sensing data policy. And that's mostly for, I guess, high resolution image distribution. So if you're not doing less than 1 meter or something, I think it should not be a problem. In any case, in your case, I guess you're not really distributing in images in any ways, because you're just building services on top and not really giving the images itself as the end data.
Yes, Narayan, that's an interesting question. So in India, we aren't allowed to sell satellite imagery directly. That is why we want to. And not just because of that, because of the requirements of our customers as well. We just want to provide them with these value-added services on top, which is direct information from the satellite imagery. As far as operating outside of India goes, we do not operate in the sub-meter domain, which is usually restricted. The reason is because our satellite imagery is richer in the spectral density that it has. And that allows us to work in all the different domains that we do, not just the spatial resolution of the imagery.
One of the main trends that I have seen in especially the satellite imagery related services are actually the use of cloud today. If you look at Amazon or even Microsoft and all the cloud services that they have started, people have started integrating imagery, storage, processing, delivery of services all on cloud. I don't think so ISRO really uses it. I'm not really aware if ISRO uses it so vigorously, where the whole downstream of data collection to then delivery of services are all cloud driven in ISRO's case as well. Is this something that you have thought about for your services, or?
Definitely. So one of the bigger problems for our customers is also the latency at which they get satellite information, and it can range anywhere from 2 to 3 days to a week, or sometimes even a month. We just want to cut that down to a few hours. Our satellite image data gets updated every day because of the global constellation, and because of partnering with companies like NewSpace, we have access to our satellite data very quickly. Then integrating cloud services gives us the option of working on this really quickly through our algorithms, and then again serving it using cloud. It becomes a very efficient process rather than having data centers of your own and then just using them. That's also costly. As far as ISRO goes, I mean, they do have a lot of amazing options that they can work with. There's an interesting story. We were working for the Techstar Starbus Accelerator. We were talking to someone, and they mentioned that some of NASA's satellites use the Amazon Gov Cloud. This is specifically for the government. It's in the US, and an option like that in India for an organization like ISRO could be really beneficial, because they will also be able to just utilize all the cloud infrastructure that is already there instead of rebuilding the wheel.
So what is the timeline like for your first mission then? So when do you expect to launch?
So as the news says, we are launching in June of next year, June, July. For that, we are almost at the final stretch now. We finished manufacturing. We are undergoing the AIT process, assembly, integration, testing. We will have a launch-ready satellite by the beginning of next year. So once that is done, it's a matter of integrating the satellite with the launch vehicle and just crossing our fingers for the launch. But we don't want to stop between having a launch-ready satellite and launching the first satellite. So this is the timeline for the first satellite, but we are also working on 2 more satellites for the end of next year.
Yeah, I think especially that SpaceX has now reduced the cost to like $5,000 per kilogram or something. Maybe interesting for you guys.
Oh, yes, definitely. I mean, we all like to joke about how there is this bubble of launch providers, but it's beneficial for companies that want to launch their small spacecrafts, because the prices are very competitive. And in the last 5 to 6 years, I would say there has been a very drastic shift. again, SpaceX is one of the reasons.
One of the interesting bits that I always think about is actually, this word indigenous, which is very used in ISRO's case. Where we always claim that, okay, the satellite is indigenous and so on. But if you actually look under the hood, there is a lot of technologies in India which we still depend on foreign suppliers. As you said, you talked about solar cells, for example. Or even in ISRO's case, they have been fundamentally trying to build a lot of them. So lithium-ion batteries are one, I think, which is now built by ISRO itself, which was earlier being procured. But solar cells, I'm not really sure if they have solar cell technology built up to be able to go from the substrate to then having the entire panel produced, and also for some other sensors and components that I also know. So one of the interesting estimates that I got from some people was that about depending on the satellite, it could be somewhere between 25 and 40% of the components being imported from suppliers abroad, which goes into the actual satellite, even in ISRO's case.
Yes, so there definitely, indigenous depends. I think one definition I would like to use for indigenous is it's being integrated and tested in over here. But definitely not all components are available in India. Solar panels are one. There is no manufacturer that builds space grade triple junction or 4-junction solar cells. There are no manufacturers for some components in terms of the high speed radios, let's say, or sometimes there are just better providers for these components outside of India. In some cases, they have space heritage. They have better documentation, better testing methodology. They have a clearer path to the whole thing. And surprisingly enough, in some cases, for some very specific components, they can also be cheaper than the providers in India. So, because they build at scale, usually. It's funny to think that an indigenous satellite, is not exactly indigenous. It definitely has, like you mentioned, around 25-30% components from outside. But we're getting there slowly. We'll hopefully in the next few years, we'll have a completely indigenously built satellite.
Yeah, fingers crossed for that for you, for sure. And when you talk about, like exporting the satellite now to Russia to get your launch, do you see any, red tape there or any kind of bottlenecks there? Because I'm not sure that there is a process set into play, or even if people know the correct process for, exporting satellites out of India, especially the private ones.
Yeah, so as long as we stick to the policy that is there, we'll be able to do that. Mostly in case, while operating in India, we've just taken one thing into consideration to stay within the limits of the policy that exists, and so far we don't see any bottlenecks to it as such.
Great. And of course you are now, I think you said you have some funding going on, and you have 2 more satellites that are planned after the first one. One of the tough things that I see in India is actually getting access to kind of Series A kind of money, where you're trying to raise, 3, 4, 5, 6 kind of $1 million to scale up your production, scale up the team and services that you want to build to the end customers. Do you think you will have access to capital for a Series A round within India, or are you, prominently looking outside of India for this?
There are multiple things, but I think one thing that would trump everything else is just that we have tremendous belief that this is a very big market for us, and we have enough validation that the technology is something that can address this market. Now, as far as finding investors goes, yes, the investors in India are a little risk averse. There are people who say that they invest in hardcore tech, but that would just mean that, they don't really invest in something which is this out of their domain. And it's fair to them as well. They don't have the experience. They don't have that kind of willingness. They don't have that kind of conviction for it. So if there are investors in India who we are able to convince, we would definitely want to raise money in India, because we feel that it will give a chance for the Indian ecosystem to grow. But again, as we move ahead to bigger rounds, we definitely have to be open to the possibility of taking in foreign money as well.
Over 10 years now, we've seen a lot of teams now come up finally trying to do independent things. Given that you are also plugged into the system now quite well in India, and a lot of young teams as well, do you see a lot more people stepping into this ecosystem, or you see, okay, this will be flat now, or people will be more scared? What is your reading like?
Yeah, so there are two answers to this. One is the conservative answer and one is the very optimistic answer. I'll start with the conservative answer. So I sometimes feel that there was this boom towards space exploration in the 60s, and that sort of reached its cusp with the moon landing in July 1969, and then it's sort of crashed because people realized that this was taking a lot of funding, a lot of energy. There is some sort of a competition again to get more and more access to space, but this time it's with private money, with billionaires getting into the race as well. That gives a more conservative estimate that yes, there might be some sort of a low time as well, and we have to expect that. But there's a very optimistic estimate as well that yes, a lot of different companies are coming, and this time when we go outside, we go there to stay. So definitely some very interesting companies in the ecosystem in India itself. We've taken a lot of inspiration from people like you, people like Sushmita ma'am, people like Rohan from Bellatrix, and so many different companies coming up. It gives us confidence as well, not just in the ecosystem, in the market. The fact that it'll just become better. I mean, it definitely won't get easier, but it'll get more. We'll have more options to work with. And in general, I feel that with the great plans that ISRO has, not just with Gaganyaan, but also with its own space station coming up, with India wanting to get that part of the pie of this modern era of the space, this modern version of the space race. We feel that the private industries and private ecosystem in India will have a very big role to play, just like it had in the US.
I hope so too. And one of the interesting bits here is if you say, okay, now you have established your services and your initial bit, and you also have this access to money, and everything is more or less aligned to you. What would a fully blown Pixxel satellite system look like? How many satellites are you talking?
So the first phase of a constellation will have 24 satellites. These will enable us to provide global coverage at a 24-hour revisit, and we'll be able to provide a latency of around 6 to 10 hours to our customers. And then from then we would want to get on to a better coverage, better latency. So yeah, the full-blown Pixxel constellation in its first phase will look like 24 satellites orbiting the planet in sun-synchronous orbits.
Do you also see a lot of other bands, like for example, SAR is emerging now. A lot of companies, new companies trying to do SAR imaging and doing it in small form factor satellites. Are you also looking at a model where you would use some of these SAR constellations and other bands of the electromagnetic spectrum that people are targeting to complement your own imagery?
Definitely. So like I initially mentioned, that we want our dataset to complement a lot of these other Earth observation datasets. SAR is difficult. It's actually commendable, the work that companies like ISA, Capella have done. Apart from that, yes, other parts of the electromagnetic spectrum as well. There's thermal infrared imagery that has its own set of applications. Then there is, again, imagery in the visible spectrum. Yes, we definitely feel that there is a scope of working with other partners, other companies in this Earth observation space to actually create more value for the customers.
One of the challenges that I have seen, many of these companies face, at least in the US, is the ability to scale up commercial services, purely commercial services, is actually still very challenging in the Earth observation realm. So if you look at Planet or any other companies, even in the other parts of the electromagnetic spectrum, SAR or anyone, you see that they still actually are heavily dependent on government and especially the intelligence and defense community. Do you think you can escape this?
That's something that we'll have to wait and watch. But I can say this, that yes, we have that confidence, we have that belief in the market, and we know that the size is big enough. It's just a matter of reaching out to customers that traditional commercial players in the Earth observation market usually haven't reached out to. And this may be due to the lack of information in the data that they provide. This may be due to resolution, due to revisit, multiple reasons. But there are a lot of people who do not have the know-how on how to work with satellite imagery. That makes it difficult for them to adopt this as a solution. But we want to open up those markets as well. So yeah, we believe that we'll be able to break out of it. But again, it's something that we'll have to wait and see how we go ahead.
Are you planning to expand your team further, next year? And if you are, then what is the kind of skill set are you looking for, so that maybe some of the people who may be listening, if it matches, maybe they can approach you for a job as well.
Sure. So yes, we are hiring at the moment. I mean, this is something that's been pending for quite some time. We have to actually put down those hiring posts, but we are looking for people on the engineering side, on the data infrastructure side, people who can work with image processing, with satellite information, satellite imagery, and people who have that experience, who have had that experience of building satellites in India primarily, and also people who have sold satellite imagery. So business development, satellite manufacturing, AIT, and data. All three positions are open. Also interns, we love working with interns as well. So if anyone who's interested in working in space technology, who has that passion for space technology, who wants to send something up there, our doors are always open.
Thank you again for getting on the show. I hope a lot of success to your team and your vision, and I hope that there's a lot more young people and experienced people in ISRO trying to come up with their own independent companies, so that we have more of the new space activity in India.
Oh, we hope so too. Thank you so much, Narayan.
Thank you for staying until the end. If you have any comments or suggestions, please write to curator@newspaceindia.com. Please consider sharing this episode with any friends or family who may be interested in learning about India's space activities. If you would like to stay in touch with the NewSpace India community, please use the link in the description to join the NewSpace India Telegram group. Feel free to also suggest guests for any future episodes. A new episode of the NewSpace India podcast is released every other Friday. Do subscribe to the podcast using Apple, Google, or any other podcasting platforms you may use.